Russia Without Putin by Tony Wood. Back in the USSR. When you are the biggest country on Earth in terms of landmass, have been even bigger in the past, have people who are, well, like people of any other country, ambitious and driven, have abundant natural resources and knowledge to exploit them, and have a security structure that can protect and defend all that, you are bound to become a superpower. And Russia became a massive one on the world stage. It still is quite a reflection of that, but to understand the state of Russia today, you have to examine the Russia of yesterday. So, after the fall of the country's imperial family in 1917, a workers' revolution erupted in this former land of Tsars, and the country became the USSR, or the Soviet Union, as it was popularly known. For decades, the Soviet Union, which included other nation-states under its banner, reigned supreme with its ideologies of equality and brotherhood. Yet, in the early 1990s, in the backdrop of the long-fought and lost Cold War, bad economy and governance, the communist utopia came crashing down under its own weight and lofty ideals. From the fall of the Soviet Union arose a new kind of Russia that believed in democracy, diplomacy, and the bounties of free market capitalism. Instead of the isolation of the USSR era, under Boris Yeltsin, the nation's first democratically elected president, Russia saw a return to friendlier relations with the West. Much like what their intelligentsia believed in the 1800s, modern Russia started seeing itself more as a European country. It was said that it was on the path to becoming a modern, democratic and capitalist country. Some of the fundamental tenets of Yeltsin's Russia were using capitalism to open up trade channels and, in the process, bolstering exports, having stronger ties with the West, particularly the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, promoting democracy through fair electoral processes and accountability. But these ambitions of having a robust and West-leaning nation would not be sustained for long. The reason for this failure? Constant rejection from the Western powers. The cool kids' table. After the Second Great War ended, the United States, along with its Western European allies, including France, the United Kingdom and Italy, among others, formed an unofficial cool kids table, called NATO. The war had primarily made members of the club realise that they were vulnerable to hostile threats if they remained divided, and, therefore, must join forces. And indeed, together, these countries held an astonishing power. Years later, a certain Eurasian country, fresh out of its isolation, desperately wanted in on this security apparatus. The newly restructured Democratic Russian Federation wanted badly to join this clique and, over the years, explicitly expressed its desire. After years of being snubbed by the cool kids, though, Russia decided that it did not mean to it that much after all, and thus the current coldness in the relationship between Russia and the Western world began. This supposed bad blood is a relatively recent development, and one man is often placed at the centre of it all. The man with the plan. When Boris Yeltsin, the first president of the Russian Federation, stepped down in 1999, a man named Vladimir Putin took charge of the country. A former KGB officer, Putin has served his country both as president and prime minister at different times over the years. Although much of the country's decisions are in his hands, the idea that he and he alone commands the will of the Russian people is not entirely true. Though a smart and famously devious individual, Putin is far from the moustache-twirling villain the Western media paints him out to be. What adds to that image are some famous myths surrounding Putin and the gang of oligarchs around him. For instance, it is said that Putin's policies are different from his predecessor, turning Russia back into a communist state, This much is false because his decisions as the nation's leader have largely supported capitalism and a continuation of Yeltsin's ideals. Similarly, it is widely believed that the oligarchs who hold much of Russia's wealth operate like mafia dons. This is a half-truth, because although many Russian oligarchs come from questionable backgrounds, at the end of the day, they are government officials who are business people first. Another myth surrounding Russia under Putin is that democracy and capitalism are failing there because of the communism hangover of the Soviet era. On the contrary, it is precisely because of the old Soviet political and social apparatus that the current system is surviving. When conversations about Russia arise, too much focus is paid to the enigma of Vladimir Putin and his cronies. It is precisely in this fixation that we lose sight of the real problem, that is, the examination of post-Soviet capitalism and its various incarnations. When the Iron Curtain fell. Before the Soviet Revolution in 1917, Russia was an imperialist nation with a powerful monarchy. They embellished themselves with untold riches and spread their influence across Europe, but the divide between the rich and the poor was a gaping chasm. From this divide came the Soviet Union. Their promise was to empower the worker and provide fair living conditions to all. However, a bitter form of capitalism surfaced when the Iron Curtain fell in the former Red State. In the early 90s, whatever remained of the Soviet elite in Russia became proud owners of industries. Oil, telecommunication, electricity, and pretty much all facets of life were up for sale to these oligarchs, who took full advantage of this opportunity. Hence, post-Soviet capitalism was marked by cronyism long before Vladimir Putin left the KGB to join politics. The state of capitalism after the fall was one of accumulated and controlled wealth and, thereby, controlled power. And this kind of capitalism was not at all Putin's invention. However, the man did give way to an increase in nepotism. Increasingly in the Putin era, family and friends of existing power brokers who agreed with him became the insiders that would run most of Russia. But if Russia is a capitalist, supposedly democratic country, why doesn't it get along with the West? The answer has more to do with reactionary politics than any grand malicious scheme. What's the beef? It's easy to make Russia the evil empire and the West the enlightened hero, but the beef between these two powerhouses is much more complex, though not an age-old one. After the Cold War ended, there was a relatively peaceful period in the Yeltsin era. Soon, however, things between the two sides, particularly Russia and the United States, went sour, fueled largely by reactionary politics. Soviet Russia was a massive territory, but once Russia became a federation, many new, smaller nations splintered out of it, including one named Ukraine. Now, Russia claims that Ukrainians and Russians are historically and politically part of the same Russian civilization, and, therefore, one people. It believes that Ukraine must return to its fold, whereas Ukrainians have repeatedly rejected this notion of oneness, and have expressed their desire to join NATO instead. Russia strongly detests this idea, for it believes that NATO military bases on its border will never be in its favour. Meanwhile, Western countries have stoked discontent by rejecting Russia's bid to join NATO, the latest of which, by the way, was put forward in Putin's era, and extending invitations to the country's rivals. This meant that not only was Russia not invited to sit with the cool kids, but the people it was fighting were invited wholeheartedly. Thus began a long journey of sanctions, threats, proxy wars, and hack attempts. These tensions are primarily between Russia and the US, but this beef isn't one of Putin's creations entirely. Sure, he might have added fuel to this issue, but he was never the sole instigator. The problem lies in the country no longer considering itself a Western nation, instead choosing to isolate itself further. Russia and the West now find themselves stuck in a blow-for-blow match, with neither side willing to back down and talk sense. Russia, however, with its widening inequality and increasing sanctions, doesn't have long to fight. The future of possibilities. As things stand today, Russia is locked in numerous battles simultaneously. These are literal battles in which it struggles to regain control over what it rightly considers its own. These battles eventually give birth to the battles it might have to fight in the future due to increased sanctions and boycotts. Although the country has a wealth of natural resources, it still depends on diplomatic ties to trade them. However, Russia has garnered immense scrutiny by waging war on a sovereign nation like Ukraine. If this bad reputation keeps up, the country looks at a future filled with economic hardships. And for the observers in the West peering at Russia like they command legions of demons, quail your fears. The bear may look terrifying, and it can be, but this one has lived its fiercest days. Focus more on the possibilities the country presents, especially its people, and particularly its youth, that wants nothing now but peace. In a nutshell, Russia is more than just its troubled past and political climate. A lack of focus on your people can bring about your destruction. The post-Soviet capitalism of Russia bears examination for anyone trying to understand the region. Vladimir Putin should not be the focus of every argument surrounding Russia. Western observers must look beyond him. Violence begets violence, and ignorance invites ignorance. The Russian oligarchs, even though from questionable backgrounds, are business people at the end of the day. Someone has got to break the cycle of senseless violence for the good of all people. Until recently, even under Putin, Russia wanted to be a part of NATO. Russia is a country filled with potential, but it's good only if it corrects its course. War brings nothing but the destruction of property and lives.